What's up, everybody? Ryan Turford, the man on the moose here, and welcome to Greatness Begins, the PlayStation 1 show where I tell you all about my 50 favorite PlayStation 1 games of all time. If you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, hit the like on the video because that helps the show get discovered. Also, let me know in the comments below what you think about today's game, because I'm actually very excited to talk about this one, as I am kind of every single week. Also, if you're listening on audio feeds, don't forget to rate us there if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And of course, check us out over on patreon.com/carpoolgaming, where we've got a bunch of cool perks, including some exclusive podcasts. So head on over there, check some of that out. Well, without further ado, let's talk about today's game, because, I mean, even though I think a lot of the games in this particular franchise that I'm going to talk about today haven't really aged super well, I think a lot of them are actually really hard to go back to today, especially if you didn't, play them back then. I wanted to make sure to at least include one game from this franchise because, again, it was one of the biggest franchises that came out of the PlayStation 1 era and then took a nosedive when it came to the PS2 era, and then eventually, came back in a great fashion where now it's one of the most popular series nowadays. So I'm excited to talk about the Tomb Raider games. I'm a fan of Tomb Raider for a long time, going back to that very first PC game where I played it on PC first. I know it came to PlayStation 1 as well, and I did eventually play it there, but I was mostly playing these games on PC at the time. And I remember, asking my grandmother for Christmas for today's game, and I remember her going out and getting it for me, and I was so excited to get it. Of course, it came in this, IDOS was doing these weird looking PC boxes at the time where they were in this weird kind of trapezoid shape. But I was so happy to finally open Tomb Raider 2 starring Lara Croft as my Christmas gift, and so excited to play this one. It was a game I was very hyped for going into it, and I know a lot of fans were actually very excited about this one. There's actually a reason why they have starring Lara Croft on the cover, because after the very first Tomb Raider game, Lara Croft basically became this huge kind of video game celebrity where she was on the cover of magazines. She was in jewelry commercials and Visa and MasterCard commercials and all kinds of crazy stuff. If you go back and watch a lot of commercials from the 90s with Lara Croft in them, some of them are really ridiculous, but she was a kind of an industry icon at the time. And the original Tomb Raider was kind of the birth of that. But if you're going to go back and play any of the PlayStation 1 era Tomb Raider games, anything, pre-Angel of Darkness on PlayStation 2, then I would actually recommend Tomb Raider 2. I think that's the one to check out. And there's a number of great reasons why. So this game actually came out on November 21st, 1997. It was actually developed by Core Design and published by IDOS Interactive, which is just funny because this version that I have here, the greatest hits version, actually includes demos on the disc, mind you, because a lot of PlayStation 1 games, if they had demos, they had their own separate demo disc that came with it, like Resident Evil that I showed last week. But here we got Soul Reaver and Tomb Raider 3, so two other IDOS hits you got a demos for on Tomb Raider 2. If you got the greatest hits version, that wasn't actually on the normal version, which is interesting when you're collecting PlayStation 1 games nowadays. Something to note is that a lot of times what ended up happening with the greatest hits versions of some games, a lot of third-party companies would include extra throw-ins, things like demos like this one. We saw that again with Resident Evil Director's Cut, or even the DualShock being added to a lot of greatest hits versions only. And even they did that even to the PS2 era with some games as well. Like Silent Hill 2, for example, on the PlayStation 2 actually has this whole other section of the story. It's got new endings and stuff like that. And it's only available on the greatest hits version of the game and not the normal version. So it's something to consider if you're ever, collecting PlayStation 1 games. What versions should you be looking out for? And a lot of times if you do your homework right, you'll find actually the greatest hits one, even though not everyone loves this green label, a lot of times you actually get some cool bonuses with it. So that's pretty cool. But I'm getting my head about myself. So the Tomb Raider 2 story, it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, for the most part, most of the PlayStation 1 Tomb Raider games, or just any of the earlier Tomb Raider games, they had stories in them, but they weren't super story focused. It was Angel of Darkness on PlayStation 2. That was really the first one that was trying to tell a big overarching narrative. Just unfortunately with that one, they just failed miserably with it, because that is a story for another day with that game, because there's a lot with the history of that game. But Tomb Raider 2, I think what set it apart from the other games is I think the gameplay is best in this one. First of all, one of the new additions they added to this game was the ability to pilot vehicles, which wasn't in any of the previous games. And they handle okay. They're not, amazing or anything like that, but I actually like the vehicle addition to it because I think it breaks up the gameplay in a great way, because the first Tomb Raider game is kind of all about solving a bunch of puzzles, and you do fight enemies, but you're really just fighting animals the whole time. But I mean, it's the only game I know of that has a Tyrannosaurus Rex in it, in this series. But, it's one of those things where it's a fun game, but it's not, amazing when it comes to its combat, and it does get a little bit repetitive, and some of the puzzles are a little bit convoluted in that first game, where I feel like Tomb Raider 2 strikes the right balance between the combat, the traversal, and the puzzles. I think all that stuff is really well balanced. I also like that you're fighting humans in this game as well as animals, so there's a nice enemy variety in this game as well. Like, it's a lot better balanced than the first game. I also found too, because you're traveling to a bunch of different locales and you're not kind of in like a couple areas like you are in the first game, like you're going to more areas and kind of like it's more of a globe-trotting adventure. I also find just the location variety is much better in Tomb Raider 2 as well, where, you're starting off at the Great Wall, but then you're going to the Arctic, you're going to these like underwater bases, you're going to all kinds of crazy places with Tomb Raider 2. So I do think that the level variety is much better in this game. And then Tomb Raider 3 and 4, they kind of, took a step in kind of the opposite direction and had their own quirks as well. But I don't know, there was something about those games that just didn't feel as high quality, I think, as playing a game like Tomb Raider 2. I also love the training mission, going around Croft Manor was super fun in this game as well. And it's not too long. It's actually like a fairly short adventure. But obviously the one downside to a game like this, though, is the controls, because they're not tank controls per se, but they're kind of like tank controls essentially, where, Laura basically just runs in a straight line depending on where you're pointing, which again, it feels very similar to Resident Evil. But you don't have to worry about, static cameras or anything like that. The camera just follows behind Laura's head essentially like that. Because again, this was kind of in the experimental era where people were just trying to get a grasp on how to make 3D games in general. But I think that Tomb Raider 2, even though the controls are a little bit wonky, I think the combat's really fun. I love the weapon variety you've got in this as well. You've got more than just your pistols. You've got a bunch of different guns at your disposal. And again, overall, I think it's a much higher quality game than the first game, and I think it's a ton of fun. So if you're a Lara Croft fan, if you're a Tomb Raider fan, if you haven't, played Tomb Raider 2 on the PlayStation 1 or PC, because it's all on Steam as well, so you can definitely check it out there, I'd highly encourage you to check it out. I mean, it's I kind of wish that we got, a HD remake of this, or something like Tomb Raider Anniversary, which was the remake we got of Tomb Raider 1, which was actually a really fun game made by Crystal Dynamics. I would love to see maybe them do like another remake like this, rather than, maybe instead of, giving us another, entry in the trilogy, I would love maybe that next Tomb Raider game to be something like a remake of 2, rather than, continuing the trilogy. Because I don't know if necessarily I want them to continue that trilogy. I love the current Tomb Raider trilogy, but I don't know if I feel like the story was like so neatly tied up with, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, that I almost don't want them to do more of them. But anyways, I think Tomb Raider 2, great game, great pickup on the PlayStation 1. And definitely, again, I had to include a Tomb Raider game on here. It would be weird if I didn't have a Tomb Raider game on this list. And definitely Tomb Raider 2 is the one to check out if you're going to play the series on PlayStation 1. I think it actually holds up pretty well. It definitely holds up the best out of all of the Tomb Raider games, I think. And I did make sure to go back and play them, all of them, for the purposes of this podcast, to make sure to kind of refresh myself, to make sure I'm actually on base with that. And totally I am. So what do you think about Tomb Raider 2? Let me know in the comments below. I also want to know what you think about the Tomb Raider series just in general. Let me know. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below, or you can hit me up on Twitter anytime at Ryan Turford. You can find us on Twitter at Carpool Gaming, on YouTube at youtube.com/Carpool Gaming, and on podcast services around the globe. So that's all for this episode of Greatness Begins. I'm Ryan Turford, and I'm out.